What if I told you that hidden deep within the Bible is a story so mysterious, so challenging, and so packed with unexpected twists that it has left even the wisest scholars speechless for centuries? Imagine a book where the innocent suffer, the faithful question everything, and the voice of God thunders out of a whirlwind, revealing secrets of creation and the limits of human understanding. This is not just any ancient text. It is the Book of Job, and what you are about to discover will change how you see faith, pain, and the very nature of God. Today, we're not just reading Job's story. We're stepping into his world, feeling the weight of his sorrow and the shock of his hope. You're about to experience the Book of Job explained like never before. So let's set aside what we think we know and get ready to uncover the astonishing truths hidden in these ancient pages. Long before there were cities or empires, there was a man named Job who lived in a land called Uz, a place many believe lay somewhere in what is now northern Jordan, Saudi Arabia, or even the southern reaches of Iraq. Picture the landscape: endless golden deserts, rocky hills stretching into the sunrise, and the air heavy with silence, as if the sand itself remembered the echoes of great suffering. Job's story begins here, in this quiet, ancient world where herds of sheep and camels moved across sun-baked ground, and every day started with the soft light of dawn breaking over the distant hills. In this land, Job was more than just a wealthy man. He was a legend, known far and wide for his honesty, kindness, and deep faith in God. Job's life at first seems perfect. He is described in the opening verses as blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. Try to imagine that, a person so respected, so trusted, that his reputation shines brighter than his gold or his fields. His house is full of laughter and life, with sons and daughters gathering to celebrate, servants caring for vast herds, and a sense of peace that feels almost unbreakable. But what truly sets Job apart is not just his riches or his big family. It's his heart, a heart devoted to God, not out of habit but out of deep, real love. Each morning, Job rises early to offer sacrifices, praying not just for himself, but for his children, saying, "Maybe my children have sinned or cursed God in their hearts." He is a father who stands in the gap, interceding for those he loves, and living every day with a powerful sense of responsibility and hope. Yet even as we see Job at the height of blessing, there is a quiet shadow stretching across his story. The ancient world believed that blessings were proof of God's favor, and suffering was a sign of secret sin or divine anger. This idea runs like a river underneath Job's world, prosperity and pain seen as rewards or punishments. But the Book of Job is about to turn all those ideas upside down, in ways no one expects. It's a story that refuses easy answers, inviting us to wrestle with the hardest questions. Why do the good sometimes suffer? Why does God allow pain when we are trying so hard to do what's right? Is faith just a bargain, or is there something deeper holding us up when life falls apart? Everything changes in a single day that starts like any other. Imagine Job, surrounded by the sounds of life, animals in the fields, children sharing stories and laughter, servants busy with their work. Then, without warning, messengers begin to arrive, each one bringing news darker than the last. First, a band of raiders sweeps in, stealing Job's oxen and donkeys and killing the servants who cared for them. Before Job can even process the shock, another messenger bursts in, saying that a fire from the sky has burned up the sheep and more servants. The disaster keeps coming. A group of raiders attacks his camels, and then, in the cruelest blow, a mighty wind destroys the house where all his children have gathered, leaving none alive except the messenger standing before him, trembling and broken. Can you picture the silence after that? One moment, Job's world was full of color and sound, and the next, everything is gone: his wealth, his livelihood, his family, and his sense of safety all swept away in a storm of tragedy. In that stillness, with his heart shattered, Job tears his robe, shaves his head, and falls to the ground. But what he does next is even more shocking. Instead of cursing God, instead of screaming out in anger, he worships. Through tears, Job whispers words that have echoed for thousands of years. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. These words don't come from shallow faith. They come from a heart that knows every good thing is a gift, and even when everything is lost, there is still a reason to trust. But this is only the beginning of Job's journey, a journey that will shake the foundations of everything he believes. Unseen by Job, a scene is unfolding in a realm far above the desert. The book of Job draws back the curtain on heaven itself, where God is surrounded by angels, and among them walks an unexpected visitor, Satan the adversary. God speaks of Job with pride, saying, "There is no one on earth like him, blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." But Satan, always looking for weakness, challenges God. He says that Job's faith is just a trade. He's faithful only because his life is easy. Take away everything he has, Satan argues, and he will surely curse you to your face. At this moment, the story lifts from earth to the highest courts of heaven, turning a personal tragedy into a cosmic question about the nature of faith. God allows Satan to test Job, but with limits. Job's possessions, his family, even his health are put at risk, but his life must be spared. Why would God allow this? Why would a loving God permit such pain? These are questions that reach far beyond Job's world, right into our own lives whenever we struggle with suffering we don't understand. As the story returns to Job's broken world, the tests grow even harsher. Stricken with terrible sores from the top of his head to the soles of his feet, Job sits in ashes, scraping his skin with a piece of pottery. The pain is almost unbearable, not just the physical agony, but the loneliness and shame as even his friends and neighbors whisper about what he must have done to deserve such a fate. Job's wife, herself drowning in grief, urges him to let go, to curse God and give up. But Job, in the midst of his pain, replies, "Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" His faith is battered, but it does not break. As Job sits in silence, the dust settling around him, three friends arrive from far away, their hearts full of sorrow for his suffering. When they see Job, they can hardly recognize him. Their grief is so great that they sit with him on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights, saying nothing, only weeping and sharing the silence of pain too deep for words. It is in this silence, where answers feel so far away, that the real questions of the book of Job begin to rise. And it is here, in the ashes and the quiet, where Job's true journey starts, not just a journey of loss, but of searching for meaning in a world turned upside down, of asking God the questions we are often too afraid to speak out loud. For 7 long days and nights, Job's friends share his pain in absolute silence, and the desert wind whispers around them like a reminder of everything that's been lost. There are no easy words, no comforting explanations, only the heavy truth that sometimes suffering is too deep for conversation. Yet even in this silence, Job's heart is wrestling with questions that have echoed through the centuries. Why does God allow suffering to touch those who are faithful? How can life be so cruel to someone who tried so hard to live the right way? As the days pass, the weight of grief and confusion finally becomes too much, and Job breaks the silence, not with answers, but with a cry that seems to rise from the deepest part of his soul. He wishes out loud that he had never been born, pouring out his sorrow in words that cut through the stillness. Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, "A boy is conceived." Job's lament is not just sadness, it's a storm of despair and confusion. He questions everything, even the meaning of his own life, wondering why anyone should have to endure such pain. This moment is raw and honest, showing that faith doesn't mean hiding your feelings or pretending that everything is okay. Job doesn't curse God, but he is not afraid to pour out his questions and heartbreak, trusting that somehow God is big enough to handle even our hardest emotions. His friends, hearing his cries, finally begin to speak, but instead of comfort, their words sting. Eliphaz, the first to answer, tries to explain Job's suffering using the old ideas of their world. He suggests that pain is a punishment, that Job must have done something wrong to deserve such misery. Who, being innocent, has ever perished? He asks. These words, though wrapped in the language of wisdom, only deepen Job's wounds. It hurts to hear someone you trust say your suffering must be your own fault, especially when you know in your heart that you have tried your best to live rightly. Bildad, another friend, goes further. He says, "When your children sinned against God, He gave them over to the penalty of their sin." For Job, a father still grieving the loss of his children, these words are almost unbearable. Bildad's thinking is simple. If you do good, God blesses you. If you suffer, you must have sinned. But the story of Job is showing us that real life is not so tidy. Sometimes the innocent do suffer, and sometimes our pain has nothing to do with anything we have done wrong. Zophar, the third friend, is even harsher. He insists that Job must have hidden sins, saying, "God has even forgotten some of your guilt." Zophar offers no comfort, just a cold call for repentance, as if everything could be fixed if Job would only admit to some secret wrongdoing. All three friends are trapped in a way of thinking that tries to make sense of suffering by blaming the person who suffers. They want answers so badly that they end up causing more pain, instead of bringing comfort or understanding. Job listens to all of this and knows in his heart that what they are saying is not true. He argues back, saying he has done nothing to deserve such pain, that he has always tried to live with honesty and faith. In one of his most famous replies, Job cries out, "Teach me, and I will be silent. Show me how I have gone wrong." He is desperate for understanding, but none comes. The silence of heaven feels heavier than ever, and Job's suffering seems to have no reason, no purpose, only more questions. It's in these moments of deep honesty that the book of Job becomes so powerful. Job's story doesn't offer easy answers or pretend that everything can be wrapped up neatly with a bow. Instead, it shows that faith can include anger, doubt, and a desperate search for meaning. Job even wishes for a mediator, someone who could stand between him and God, helping him to find answers or at least a bit of hope. "If only there were someone to mediate between us," he says. These words echo with longing, a deep need for connection and understanding in the midst of chaos. As Job's questions become cries, his faith does not disappear. In fact, his willingness to speak honestly to God is itself a form of faith, trusting that God is still listening, even when he seems silent. Have you ever felt like Job, crying out in pain and confusion, hoping that someone, anyone, was listening? Job's story tells us that it's okay to bring our hardest feelings to God, even if we don't have the answers. But the conversation between Job and his friends continues, turning into a long, complicated debate about why bad things happen and what it means to trust God. Job refuses to back down, holding onto his innocence and his hope that God is good, even when everything in his life has fallen apart. He makes a declaration of faith that shines like a light in the darkness. Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. These words, full of pain and courage, capture the heart of the book of Job, a faith that holds on even when nothing makes sense. Still, Job's struggle is not over. His friends keep repeating their old ideas, each speech filled with more accusations and less compassion. The story begins to feel stuck, as if no one really knows what to say anymore. But then, out of nowhere, a new voice enters the story. A young man named Elihu, who has been quietly listening to everything that has been said. Elihu is passionate and bold, offering a new perspective. He respects the elders, but he is not afraid to challenge them or even Job himself. Elihu argues that suffering is not always a punishment and that God can use pain to teach, correct, or draw us closer to him. He reminds Job and his friends that God's wisdom is much greater than theirs, and that maybe, just maybe, there is a purpose behind all the pain that they cannot yet see. As Elihu's words fade into the warm, heavy air of the desert, the story reaches its most mysterious moment. The wind begins to rise and dark clouds gather over the hills, as if creation itself is holding its breath, waiting for something extraordinary to happen. And then, from the whirlwind, a voice like thunder begins to speak. The voice is not Elihu's, nor is it the echo of any human wisdom. It is the voice of the Almighty God himself. Out of the storm and the swirling desert winds comes a sound so powerful, so commanding, that it silences every argument, every complaint, every broken cry. And yet what God says is not what Job or his friends expected. He does not begin with answers. He does not explain why Job has suffered. Instead, he begins with a question. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? The voice shakes the air, but it does not condemn. It invites. Brace yourself like a man, God says. I will question you, and you shall answer me. The silence is replaced with awe. God begins to speak not of pain or justice or guilt, but of creation, of the foundations of the earth, the birth of the seas, the boundaries of light and darkness. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? God asks. These are not questions meant to shame. They are questions meant to open Job's heart to something deeper, the truth that God's wisdom is far beyond human understanding. One after another, the questions come, each one more breathtaking than the last. Have you ever commanded the morning to appear and caused the dawn to rise in the east? Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loosen Orion's belt? Do you give the horse its strength or clothe its neck with a flowing mane? Each question draws Job and us into a vision of the universe where God is not distant or careless, but intimately involved in every detail of creation. The stars, the animals, the rain, the thunder, all obey his voice. God speaks of the hawk's flight, the eagle's nest, the snow's secret storehouses, and the hidden pathways of lightning. The whirlwind becomes a classroom and God its teacher. But what is he teaching? That Job's suffering matters less. No, that Job was wrong to cry out. Not at all. He is showing Job that there is more happening in the world than Job can see, that there is a wisdom so deep and wide that even the pain we do not understand is still held within the boundaries of divine care. And then, as the storm begins to calm, God introduces two creatures so strange and powerful that they seem to belong more to myth than to nature: Behemoth and Leviathan. These are not just animals. They are symbols of chaos, of the wild and untamed parts of creation that no man can control. Behemoth moves with the strength of bronze, drinks from the river without fear, and eats grass like an ox. Leviathan breathes fire, thrashes the seas, and cannot be captured by any human force. Can you pull in Leviathan with a fishhook? God asks. The answer is clear. Only God has mastery over such power. But why does God speak of these creatures? Why, after so much silence, would he describe monsters instead of offering comfort? Because these beasts represent everything Job cannot tame: his pain, his questions, the forces of loss and mystery. And by showing that he and he alone can control these creatures, God is reminding Job that he is still sovereign, still good, even over the most terrifying parts of life. It is a vision of power, yes, but also of care. A creator who not only makes the stars, but also holds the chaos in his hands. In that moment, Job understands something deeper than all the arguments, all the theology, all the pain. He sees that God has not abandoned him, that even though he never got the explanation he wanted, he received something greater, the presence of God himself. And it is that presence, not the answers, that brings peace. Job's reply is quiet, humble, and full of awe. I know that you can do all things, he says, and that no purpose of yours can be stopped. He admits that his words were spoken from a place of pain and confusion, and then he says something that reveals the full transformation of his heart. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I repent in dust and ashes. Job is not repenting for sin that caused his suffering, because there was none. He is repenting for thinking that he could understand everything God was doing. He is surrendering his need for control, and in that surrender he finds peace. Have you ever reached a place like this, where the need for answers fades and all that remains is awe, where the questions still linger but somehow the presence of God makes them less heavy? Job's story shows us that sometimes the most powerful healing doesn't come from explanations, but from encounter, from seeing God not just with our theology, but with our soul. As Job kneels in the dust, the whirlwind fades. The storm has passed, but its lessons remain. He has lost so much, and not everything can be replaced. Yet something has been restored, something invisible but unshakable: his faith, his trust, his understanding of who God is. But this is not the end. The story does not close in silence or sadness. In a surprising twist, the narrative turns toward restoration. God rebukes Job's friends for speaking falsely about him. He tells Eliphaz, I am angry with you and your two friends because you have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has. Then, in a moment full of grace and beauty, God tells the friends to bring offerings and ask Job to pray for them. And Job, this man who had every right to be bitter, prays. He forgives. He intercedes. And it is after this act of mercy that the restoration begins, not before. The Lord restores Job's fortunes, giving him twice as much as he had before. His household is rebuilt. His family grows again. He is blessed with 7 sons and 3 daughters, the most beautiful in all the land. And in a culture where women rarely received inheritance, Job gives his daughters an equal share, proof that his view of justice and love has been changed forever by his encounter with God. The story of Job ends with these words: "The Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the former." But we must not mistake this for a simple reward or a happy ending in the way we often expect. Job's new children do not erase the memory of the ones he lost. His wealth does not remove the scars, but his heart is full again, not because all was restored, but because his trust in God was. And maybe that's the real message of the book of Job, that faith is not a contract where blessings are traded for obedience, but a relationship that can survive even the darkest storms. That suffering is not a sign of failure, and silence is not proof of absence. That even when we are surrounded by ashes, God is still speaking, still working, still holding us close. This is what makes the book of Job so different from every other story in the Bible. It refuses to give us neat conclusions or simple formulas. Instead, it gives us something more powerful: truth wrapped in mystery, comfort found through chaos, and hope that lives even in the ashes. Job's story is not about getting answers to every question. It's about learning to live without them and still trusting that God is good. In a world where we are constantly looking for explanations and reasons, the book of Job whispers something deeper to our hearts. Sometimes, the reason we suffer will remain hidden, but God's presence is never far. And this message isn't just for Job. It's for anyone who has ever cried out in the dark, asking, "Why, God?" It's for those who have lost a child, watched a loved one fade away, faced illness, betrayal, financial ruin, or crushing loneliness. Job stands beside you in your questions. He shows us that you can love God and still feel broken. You can trust Him and still ask why. You can be full of faith and full of pain at the same time. The book of Job gives us permission to be human, to lament, to wrestle, to feel, and to still remain within the arms of a sovereign, loving God. What's even more remarkable is how the book invites us not only to see Job's transformation, but to consider our own. After everything he lost, Job ends up with more than material wealth. He ends up with wisdom, with compassion, with a deeper awareness of God's power and kindness. The same man who once feared for his children now entrusts them to a God he knows personally. The one who once begged for answers now rests in awe. His story reminds us that suffering can refine us, not because pain itself is good, but because God can bring beauty out of even the most broken places. And isn't that what we long for? Not just comfort, but transformation. Not just answers, but a new kind of peace. The kind that doesn't depend on circumstances, but on knowing that God sees us, hears us, and walks with us through every season. The book of Job doesn't just tell us a story. It invites us into a journey, one where we, like Job, can be honest with our grief, bold in our questions, and open to encountering God in ways we never expected. Even the very structure of the book reflects this journey. It begins with prose, shifts into rich poetic dialogue, then returns to prose again in the end. It's as if the text itself mirrors Job's emotional movement, from order to chaos and back to restoration. The poetry, full of metaphor, repetition, and imagery, invites us to feel the rawness of Job's emotions. His laments aren't dry speeches, they are cries from the deepest places of the heart. And in responding to those cries, God does not dismiss Job's pain. He enters into it with power and presence. As we reread the whirlwind speech, we notice something else. God never once tells Job why he suffered. He never mentions Satan. He never explains the wager or the heavenly courtroom. This silence is deliberate, because the book is not about the mechanics of divine decisions. It's about the posture of the human heart. God doesn't give Job control. He gives him something better: perspective, a vision of the vastness of creation, a reminder that the world is not chaotic but deeply ordered by a hand that sees more than we ever could. Think about this. In the middle of Job's pain, God talks about the birth of the mountain goats, the path of the lightning, and the feeding of the ravens. Why? Because even the small, hidden things are under his care. If he feeds the wild animals and commands the stars, how much more does he see and love us? The message is clear, even if unspoken. Job is not alone, and neither are we. There's another important shift we see by the end of the book. Job is no longer the same man who offered daily sacrifices just in case his children sinned. He no longer lives in fear of what might go wrong. Now, he lives in reverence of a God who has shown him his glory and invited him into trust. The man who once dreaded disaster becomes the man who praises God in the midst of it. That's the kind of transformation suffering can bring when it meets the presence of God. We must also consider the role of Job's friends in this story, because they represent a danger that still exists today: the temptation to explain suffering too quickly. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar each offer ideas that sound religious, even wise, but they lack compassion. They assume that if someone is suffering, it must be because of sin. They speak more than they listen, and in their desire to protect God's justice, they end up misrepresenting his heart. Their speeches are filled with certainty, but empty of comfort. How often are we like them? How often do we look at another's pain and try to fix it with words? The book of Job reminds us that presence is more powerful than explanations. That silence, when shared in love, can speak louder than theology shouted from a distance. God honors Job's honesty but rebukes his friends' arrogance. It is Job, the sufferer, who is called a servant of God. And it is Job's prayer that restores his friends, not their own repentance, but the intercession of the man they misjudged. There is something deeply beautiful about this. Job, now healed, now restored, does not hold a grudge. He does not speak with bitterness. He prays for the very ones who wounded him. This act of grace mirrors the heart of God himself, a heart that forgives, restores, and brings new life even when we've fallen short. By the final verses, we see a world made new, not perfect, but filled with hope. Job's blessings are multiplied. His legacy is expanded. But the greatest change is invisible. It's the peace that now fills his heart, the wisdom etched into his soul, the kind that can only come from walking through the fire and coming out refined, not burned. And for us, reading this story centuries later, the invitation remains: to trust God not just when life makes sense, but when it doesn't. To hold on to faith, not because we see the outcome, but because we know the one who holds the outcome in his hands. Job's story is not about winning back what was lost. It's about becoming someone new in the process. It's about seeing God with new eyes, hearing him with new ears, and living with a heart that has been broken and healed by the presence of the Almighty. So when you face your own whirlwind, when life shatters your plans and silence fills your prayers, remember Job. Remember the God who answered not with explanations, but with glory. And know that the same God who spoke from the storm then still speaks today. He speaks not always in the ways we expect, not through lightning bolts of clarity or sudden fixes to our problems, but through whispers in the dark, through peace that doesn't make sense, and through the quiet strength that rises up when we feel too weak to stand. Just like Job, we may not receive an explanation for our suffering, but we are never left alone in it. The voice that spoke from the whirlwind still echoes in the hearts of those who listen, reminding us that there is a wisdom deeper than ours and a love more steadfast than any storm. This is what gives the book of Job its timeless power. It's not just a record of one man's tragedy and redemption. It's a mirror held up to every human soul that has ever wrestled with grief, injustice, or the silence of heaven. It shows us that true faith is not proven in blessings, but in brokenness. That worship is most meaningful not when everything is going well, but when we raise our hands and say, "Blessed be the name of the Lord," even when we are surrounded by dust and ashes. There is also something powerful in the fact that Job never turns away from God. Yes, he questions, he laments, he even accuses, but he always directs those cries to God, never away from him. And that is a lesson for us too. God is not afraid of our honesty. He invites it. He welcomes our raw, unfiltered prayers. The Psalms echo the same truth. David wept, shouted, and pleaded with God, and he was called a man after God's own heart. Job teaches us that God values a heart that stays in the conversation, even when the conversation gets hard. Think about how rare that is in our world today. When people face tragedy, many walk away from faith, thinking God has failed them. But the book of Job says something different. That staying with God, even in your confusion, is the ultimate act of trust. And that kind of faith, the kind that keeps showing up even when it hurts, is what God honors most. One of the most haunting and beautiful lines in the entire book is when Job, in the middle of his pain, says, "I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth." These words, spoken before Jesus ever walked the earth, point forward to a hope that transcends death, pain, and time itself. Job didn't know how his story would end, but he believed there was a Redeemer coming, someone who would bring justice, restore the broken, and make all things new. And we, reading this story today, now know who that Redeemer is. Jesus Christ, the one who came not to explain suffering away, but to enter into it with us. The one who, like Job, was blameless, who lost everything, was misunderstood by his friends, cried out to the Father, and was ultimately restored in glory. In many ways, Job is a foreshadowing, a preview of the suffering servant who would one day carry the full weight of the world's pain. This connection makes Job's story even more powerful, because it means that when we suffer, we don't suffer alone. We follow in the footsteps of saints and saviors, of prophets and redeemers. Our pain is not proof that God has abandoned us. It's proof that we're part of a story much bigger than ourselves. A story where resurrection always follows death, where restoration follows loss, and where every tear is seen and counted by a God who deeply cares. Job's restoration, too, teaches us something vital. Yes, he received double what he had before, but the emphasis in the final chapter isn't on what Job got back. It's on the kind of man he became through the fire. His new daughters are named and given inheritance, something unheard of in his culture. His faith is no longer based on fear or duty, but on deep, personal experience with the living God. He is a man transformed, not because his wealth returned, but because his vision of God changed forever. We live in a time where people often equate blessing with proof that God is with them. But Job turns that idea upside down. He was closest to God when he had nothing. He encountered the Almighty not in his palace, but in his pain. And that encounter changed everything. For Job, The real reward was not more cattle or gold or even children. It was seeing God with his own eyes, hearing him speak, and knowing deep in his soul that he was never truly alone. Have you ever had a moment like that, where something in your life was falling apart, and yet in the middle of the chaos, you felt God was near? Maybe it wasn't a loud voice, but a quiet peace. A verse you read at just the right time. A friend who showed up with exactly the words you needed. That's the same God who met Job in the whirlwind, still speaking, still loving, still restoring. The book of Job isn't trying to make us feel better about pain. It's not a spiritual band-aid. Instead, it's a call to deeper faith, a kind of faith that can walk through fire and come out refined. A faith that doesn't depend on circumstances, but rests in the unshakable character of God. It's a reminder that suffering is not always punishment, that unanswered prayers are not always rejection, and that silence is sometimes just a space for transformation. As we reflect on this story, we realize that Job's journey is not just one of endurance. It's a journey of beholding, of finally seeing the God who had been there all along. And maybe, in our own lives, that's the invitation waiting for us too. Not to understand everything, but to lift our eyes, open our hearts, and say, "Now my eyes have seen you." When you stand in the ashes of something that used to be beautiful, when your questions echo in the silence, when the blessings you once held are gone, remember Job. Remember that even then, God is not finished. That even then, he is speaking. And even then, he is preparing to reveal his glory to you in ways you never imagined. Because in the end, Job's story is not about suffering, it's about seeing. And once you've seen God, truly seen him, nothing else can ever be the same. That's the real climax of the book of Job, not when the riches return, not when his health is restored, but when Job finally moves from hearing about God to seeing him. That moment, simple, quiet, yet earth-shaking, is what the entire story has been leading to. "My ears had heard of you," Job says, "but now my eyes have seen you." And that single shift changes everything. It reframes all the suffering, the confusion, the silence, not by making it disappear, but by giving it new meaning. When we see God for who he truly is, not just as an idea or tradition, but as the living, present, and holy creator, we begin to see everything else differently too. And maybe that's what the book of Job has been doing in your heart this whole time. Maybe, like Job, you've lived faithfully, done your best, feared God, and tried to walk upright, and still, suffering found you. Maybe you've looked around and wondered why others seem to be blessed while your prayers go unanswered. Maybe you've sat in your own pile of ashes, scraping at wounds no one else can see, whispering questions into the silence. If that's you, then Job's story is your story. It's a sacred mirror, showing you that you're not alone in your grief or your questions, and that your pain is not a sign that God has abandoned you. It may, in fact, be the very place where he plans to meet you. So many of us have been taught that if we just believe hard enough, pray long enough, or behave righteously enough, our lives will be smooth and protected. But the book of Job challenges that belief with holy fire. It tells us that sometimes the most faithful people are the ones who suffer most deeply, not because they did something wrong, but because they are part of a divine mystery that stretches beyond what we can see. In Job's case, it was his very faithfulness that made him the focus of the heavenly conversation. That might not sit comfortably with us, but it reveals something powerful. God trusts Job's faith. He believes Job's devotion is not dependent on gifts, but rooted in relationship. And that raises a question we all must face at some point. Do we love God only because of what He gives us or because of who He is? If everything were stripped away, comfort, health, success, would we still trust Him? Would we still worship? Would we still call Him good? The book of Job doesn't answer that for us. It asks us to wrestle with it slowly, honestly, painfully. And as we do, we may discover a deeper kind of faith, not the kind built on blessings, but the kind built on encounter. There's also something deeply encouraging in the fact that Job's cries, laments, and questions were not punished. In fact, God says that Job spoke rightly about him, unlike his friends. Think about that. God honors the one who wrestled with him, who dared to ask, who brought his anger and confusion to the throne. It tells us that God is not looking for polished prayers or perfect theology. He wants real relationship, honest, raw, unfiltered. Just like any loving father wants his children to come to him, even when they're crying, angry, or confused, so God invites us to do the same. And in that sacred space, between the ashes of suffering and the presence of God, a transformation takes place. The book of Job is not just about loss or even recovery. It's about how pain can make space for deeper intimacy with God. How the whirlwind, terrifying as it is, can become the very voice that awakens our souls. How the deepest wounds can lead to the clearest visions. Job's wounds didn't disappear immediately, and some scars may have stayed with him forever. But his heart, his mind, his spirit, those were made new. This story also reminds us that we don't need to rush past suffering to get to the good part. Too often, we want to jump from chapter 1 to the restoration, skipping all the messy middle. But it's in the middle, in the long, painful, silent chapters, that God often does His most powerful work. That's where we learn to listen, to wait, to surrender. That's where faith is forged. And that's where we stop trying to control God and start trusting Him. It's also important to notice the role that time plays in this story. The suffering wasn't over in a day. The friends sat with Job for 7 days before even speaking. The dialogues and laments stretch over many chapters. The restoration, too, doesn't come as a quick fix. All of this reminds us that healing is a process. Growth takes time, trust takes time, and God is not in a hurry. He is more interested in transformation than speed. So if you find yourself still in the waiting, still in the in-between, know this: that place is not wasted. It is sacred ground. And while Job's story is ancient, it is also incredibly modern. We still wrestle with the same questions he did. We still live in a world where the innocent suffer, where justice is delayed, where prayers sometimes feel unanswered. But we also live in a world where God is still speaking, from Scripture, from creation, from within our own spirits. The whirlwind may not be visible, but His voice is still powerful. His presence still surrounds us, and His love still holds us steady, even when the ground beneath us shakes. In many ways, the book of Job invites us to live with mystery, to stop demanding tidy conclusions and start embracing the wonder of God's ways. That doesn't mean we stop asking questions. It means we learn to ask with humility, knowing that some answers will only come on the other side of eternity. But in the meantime, we can walk with the confidence that we are deeply seen, deeply known, and deeply loved. And maybe, just maybe, our own journey will begin to mirror Job's, not in the details, but in the shape. Maybe we, too, will move from order to chaos, to encounter, and finally to restoration. Maybe our own stories will be ones of deep loss and deep faith, of hard questions and honest prayers, of pain that leads to presence and wounds that lead to wonder. Because the book of Job isn't just about one man, it's about all of us. It's about the God who speaks from storms, who holds the stars and still kneels beside the suffering. It's about the Redeemer who lives and the promise that one day every tear will be wiped away. And until that day comes, Job's words remain a banner over our lives. Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. These words, carried through the centuries, are not a quiet whisper of surrender. They are a declaration of defiant faith. Job isn't saying that suffering doesn't matter. He isn't pretending the pain isn't real. He is saying that even when his world has collapsed, even when his prayers are met with silence, he will choose to place his hope not in outcomes, but in the character of God himself. That kind of hope is rare. It is forged in the fire. It is the kind of hope that looks into the face of the unknown and still says, God is enough. And maybe that's the invitation for us too, to move beyond a faith that only functions when life is easy, to grow into a faith that stands firm when the storm rages and the ground shakes, to discover that true trust is not built on the blessings we hold, but on the one who holds us. The book of Job isn't about escaping pain, it's about being held through it. It's about discovering that our Redeemer is not far off, but right in the center of the whirlwind. As we look back over Job's journey, we begin to see a shape emerge. It's not a straight line and it's not a tidy arc. It's more like a spiral, circling through grief, questions, silence, confrontation, and finally vision. That's what makes Job's story so relatable. Because most of us don't heal in straight lines. We stumble. We ask the same questions more than once. We believe, then doubt, then believe again. And through it all, God remains. It's also worth remembering that Job never receives a direct answer to the why of his suffering. God never says, "This is why I let this happen." And yet, Job is satisfied. Why? Because the answer he does receive is God himself. The presence of the Almighty, the one who laid the foundations of the earth, who commands the morning, who counts the drops of dew, that is the answer. And that's enough. In the presence of God, the need for explanations fades. And still, that doesn't mean the pain disappears. Job's story doesn't erase suffering, it transforms it. The scars may remain, but so does the strength. The questions may linger, but so does the quiet certainty that God is still sovereign, still good, and still near. This is a deeper kind of peace, not the absence of trouble, but the presence of God in the trouble. It's the peace that Paul would later describe as beyond understanding. The kind that guards hearts and minds even when the world is falling apart. Let's not miss the depth of what God does in the final chapters. He doesn't just speak from the whirlwind, he restores. But notice how the restoration begins. It starts not with wealth or livestock, but with Job praying for the very friends who hurt him. The act of intercession becomes the turning point. Job forgives. He lifts others up in prayer, and then his own healing begins. This is a profound truth. Sometimes our breakthrough comes when we stop focusing on our pain and start standing in the gap for others. And when the restoration comes, it is full and rich. Job receives double what he had before, not just animals or land, but a new family and a renewed legacy. His daughters are named, something incredibly rare in ancient texts, and described as the most beautiful in all the land. And more than that, they are given inheritance alongside their brothers, signaling a radical shift in Job's heart and understanding of justice. This is not just restoration, it is transformation. Job is not just returned to where he was. He has been changed, and so has his world. This detail matters because God doesn't just rewind the tape of Job's life. He writes a new ending, one marked by beauty, equity, and peace. And that's what God does for us too. He doesn't erase our past, but He weaves it into a new story. He takes our sorrow and writes resurrection. He takes what was meant for harm and uses it for good. That's the pattern of Scripture from beginning to end. And Job sits right in the middle of that pattern, proof that even in the darkest moments, God is still writing, still working, still redeeming. But perhaps one of the most meaningful parts of the book of Job is this: Job's suffering was never meaningless. We know from the heavenly courtroom scene in the beginning that Job's life was bearing witness to something far greater than himself. His faith was a testimony not only on earth, but in heaven. And even though Job didn't know it, even though he never learned about that conversation between God and Satan, his steadfastness changed everything. That truth should stir something in us. Because maybe, right now, your pain is being watched by more than you realize. Maybe your faith is speaking louder than you think. Maybe, in the silence, your trust in God is echoing through eternity. Job reminds us that sometimes our story isn't just about us. It's about what God is doing in and through us, for reasons far beyond what we can comprehend. And that is where we find peace, not in understanding everything, but in trusting that God does. The one who commands the constellations, who feeds the ravens, who governs the seas, He sees you. He knows your name. He has numbered every hair on your head, and even when He feels distant, He is closer than your breath. So if you are walking through your own season of loss or doubt or waiting, take heart. Job's story was not the end, it was the beginning of something far greater. And your story, too, is still unfolding. God is not done. The whirlwind may be loud, the silence may be long, but the Redeemer lives. And because He lives, so does your hope. Hope in the world of Job doesn't look like a wish or a dream. It looks like endurance. It looks like refusing to let go of God's hand, even when you can't see His face. It looks like waking up another day, sitting in the dust, scraping your wounds and still whispering prayers into the silence. Hope is not denial. It's not pretending the pain isn't real. Hope is knowing that pain is not the end of the story. And Job's journey teaches us that sometimes the most sacred thing you can do is simply not give up. Think about how powerful that is in today's world. We live in a time of instant answers, fast fixes, and easy exits. But the book of Job calls us to something slower, deeper, and more honest. It calls us to stay, to wait, to remain faithful when there is no sign of a reward. That is what real hope looks like, and that is what real faith looks like. Not in the absence of questions, but in the presence of perseverance. Not because we understand what God is doing, but because we trust who He is. That's why Job's final declaration, "Now my eyes have seen you," is not just about seeing God with physical eyes. It's about spiritual clarity. It's about moving from theory to experience, from religion to relationship, from routine belief to personal encounter. And once you've seen God in that way, once you've felt His presence in your deepest sorrow, your faith is never the same. It becomes real, untouchable, unshakable. The kind of faith that doesn't need everything to be explained because it has seen the one who holds the answers. And in Job's case, that encounter not only transformed him, it revealed God's own heart. Because the God who shows up in the whirlwind is not angry, distant, or cruel. He is majestic, yes, powerful, yes, but also present. He comes down into the storm, He speaks, He reveals, He makes Himself known. And that tells us everything about who He is. A God who does not stay on His throne while His children suffer. A God who draws near. A God who answers, not always with explanations, but always with himself. That's what the whirlwind is about. It's not just a symbol of chaos, it's a meeting place, a sacred space where the creator of the universe meets his creation. And maybe, just maybe, your own whirlwind is not the end, but the beginning of that meeting. Maybe your storm is holy ground. Maybe what looks like destruction is actually preparation. Maybe your pain is not punishment, but invitation. That invitation isn't to comfort, it's to communion. God doesn't promise Job an easy life. He doesn't offer him a theological checklist or a list of reasons. He offers his voice, his presence, his truth. And in doing so, he shows Job and us that what we need most is not a reason why we suffer, but a God who walks with us through it. And walk with us he does. That truth echoes even louder when we remember the story of Jesus, the one who, like Job, was innocent and blameless, the one who suffered not for his own sin but for ours, the one who cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" and received no answer so that we could always have one. Jesus is the Redeemer Job longed for, the mediator he imagined, the fulfillment of every silent cry Job ever uttered. And in Jesus, we find not only someone who understands our suffering, but someone who redeems it. He takes our ashes and trades them for beauty. He takes our mourning and turns it into dancing. He doesn't remove the pain, he transforms it, just like he did for Job. So when you feel like Job, when you're sitting in silence, surrounded by loss, misunderstood by those around you, remember that you're not forgotten. Remember that your Redeemer lives. And because he lives, your pain has purpose. Your suffering has weight. Your faith is being refined like gold in the fire. One of the most beautiful lessons hidden in Job's restoration is that healing doesn't always look like going back. Sometimes it looks like going forward with a deeper wisdom, a softer heart, and a firmer grip on grace. Job didn't get his old life back, he got something new. And though it didn't erase the past, it honored it. It built upon it. God didn't waste a single tear, a single cry, a single moment in the ashes. And he won't waste yours either. In fact, your story may be the very thing that speaks life into someone else's suffering. Just as we read Job's story and find strength, someone may one day look at your endurance, your faith, your quiet hope in the storm, and find the courage to keep going. This is the power of testimony, not just in the words we say, but in the lives we live. Because the world is full of people sitting in silence right now, wondering if anyone sees them, if anyone understands. And when we carry Job's story in our hearts, we become the kind of people who do understand. The kind of people who don't rush to explain, but choose to sit and weep and listen. The kind of people who remind others, you are not alone. God is near, and the whirlwind is not the end. This is the legacy of the book of Job, not just endurance, but empathy. Not just theology, but transformation. Not just a story of long ago, but a living reminder that we are part of this sacred conversation. That we too are invited to see God, to hear his voice, and to let our lives be shaped not by fear, but by faith. So let Job's journey speak into your own. Let it remind you that mystery is not the enemy of faith. It is often the place where faith is born. Let it guide you back to the God who sees, who speaks, and who restores. And may you, like Job, come to the end of your long night, lift your eyes to the sky, and say with full assurance, "My Redeemer lives, and now I have seen him." There is something sacred in those words, something that reaches through time and speaks directly to every soul that has ever sat in silence, waiting for God to answer. Because Job didn't get all the answers he wanted, but he got the one thing he needed most, the nearness of God. And once you've seen him, even just a glimpse, your life is never the same. Pain might remain, but so does the peace. Questions may still echo, but they echo in a heart that now knows who holds the universe. And this is the quiet power of the book of Job. It doesn't rush to explain. It teaches us how to endure before we understand. It leads us into the wilderness, not to leave us there, but to show us what cannot be shaken. Because what was tested in Job's life wasn't just his wealth or health or reputation. It was his foundation. And when everything else was taken, his foundation, his faith held. Barely at times, maybe, bruised and exhausted, but it held. And maybe that's what God is building in you too. Not just comfort or understanding, but depth. A soul with roots so deep in God that even when the winds come, it remains. A trust that can outlast silence. A worship that rises even when blessings don't. That kind of faith can't be faked. It's forged. And Job is proof that it's possible. There's another detail in Job's story that's easy to miss but rich with meaning. It's that God not only restores Job's life, he honors him. He tells Job's friends, the ones who tried to defend God but got it wrong, to go to Job and ask him to pray for them. Can you imagine that moment? Job, still tender from his wounds, is asked to become a priest for the very ones who misunderstood him. And what does he do? He prays, not with bitterness but with compassion. That act of intercession is a turning point, not just for them but for him. Because when Job prays for others, healing begins to flood his own life. This, too, is part of the mystery. Sometimes healing comes when we stop asking, "Why me?" and start asking, "Who can I bless from this place?" That doesn't erase the pain, but it transforms it. It gives it purpose. It allows God to take ashes and breathe life into them again. And it teaches us that even in our brokenness, we are still vessels of grace. So maybe you're not at the end of your story yet. Maybe you're somewhere in the middle, between loss and restoration, between silence and vision. If so, you are not alone. Job's journey is the echo of your own, and his Redeemer is your Redeemer. The same God who spoke from the whirlwind still speaks. Maybe not in ways we expect. Maybe not with the clarity we crave, but always with love, always with presence, always with the long view in mind. Because Job's story wasn't just about Job, it was about God, his glory, his justice, his nearness, and the same is true for us. Our stories, as painful or confusing as they may be, are threads in a much bigger tapestry. We don't see the full picture yet. We see knots and frayed edges. But one day we will see the whole design. And when we do, we'll realize that every moment, every cry, every question, every silence was held in the hands of a faithful God. And when we look back, we may not remember the exact pain, but we will remember the one who met us in it. The one who walked beside us when no one else understood. The one who didn't remove the storm but stood in the middle of it with us. That is the God of Job, not a distant deity, but a present Father, a creator who commands the stars and catches our tears. So let this story remind you, your suffering is seen, your questions are heard, and your Redeemer lives. The wind may howl, the night may stretch long, but dawn is coming, and with it a new understanding, a deeper peace. A clearer vision of the one who never left your side. Let Job's words be your anthem when answers are scarce. Even if he slays me, I will trust him. Not because suffering is good, but because God is. Not because we understand, but because he does. Not because the pain is gone, but because he is there, right in the middle of it. And as you hold on through the storm, know this. You are not just enduring, you are being formed, refined, strengthened, prepared, because the whirlwind never has the final word. God does, and his word is always love, his word is always purpose, his word is always life. And someday, like Job, You will look back, not with bitterness but with awe, and say, I had heard of you, but now I have seen you. That confession, quiet, reverent, full of holy wonder, is not just the end of a story, it's the beginning of a deeper faith. It's the moment where belief becomes encounter, where God moves from concept to reality. And what's most powerful is that this vision doesn't come during a peaceful sunrise or a temple ceremony. It comes in the whirlwind, in the noise, in the confusion. That's where Job sees him. And maybe that's exactly where we're meant to see him too. Because the God of the whirlwind is not fragile. He's not afraid of our pain. He doesn't back away when life gets messy. He enters in. He speaks from the storm. And when he speaks, he doesn't justify himself. He doesn't offer a list of reasons. He asks questions that stretch Job's imagination, that reveal the vastness of creation and the smallness of human understanding. Questions like, where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Can you command the morning? Do you give the horse its strength? At first, they seem intimidating, but they are invitations. They invite Job and us to remember who God really is. And that's part of healing, because when we suffer, our world becomes small, our vision narrows. Pain has a way of shrinking the horizon, but God's voice reopens the sky. His words pull us out of the ashes and lift our eyes to the stars, not to make us feel insignificant, but to remind us that the one who governs galaxies is the same one who knows our name. He is not distant, he is sovereign, and he is close. This shift is what transforms Job, not a change in his circumstances, but a change in his vision. And that's what God often does in our lives too. He doesn't always remove the trial, but he renews our sight. He expands our understanding. He deepens our trust. He anchors our souls not in explanations, but in himself. That's why the book of Job is not a tragedy. It's a triumph. Not because pain is good, but because faith is stronger. Not because Job got everything back, but because he got something better, a direct encounter with the living God. And through that encounter, everything else changed. His past was redeemed. His future was rebuilt. And his story, his sacred, messy, raw story, became a testimony for generations to come. And that's the invitation still standing for us. To let our wounds become windows. To let our questions drive us toward God, not away from him. To let the whirlwind be a meeting place, not just a place of fear. Because every storm we walk through is an opportunity to see God more clearly, not always with our eyes, but with our hearts. And here's the beautiful truth. God never rebukes Job for asking hard questions. He doesn't punish him for lamenting. In fact, he honors Job for speaking honestly. That should shatter the false belief that God only wants polite prayers. He wants real ones. He wants the cries of the heart, the trembling hands, the broken voices, because those are the prayers of someone who still believes enough to reach out. And that kind of faith is precious to God. Even more, God defends Job. He tells the friends who spoke out of religious pride and shallow theology, "You have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." Imagine that. God standing up for the man who wrestled with him, who questioned him, who cried out in anguish. It tells us something profound about the heart of God. He is not afraid of our honesty. He welcomes it. And maybe that's the most healing truth of all. That God doesn't love some sanitized version of us. He loves us as we are, in the middle of the storm, with our tears, our doubts, our scraped knees and tired hearts. He sees it all, and still he calls us beloved. So if you've been afraid to come to God because you didn't have the right words, let Job free you. If you've been taught that faith means never struggling, let this story reset your understanding. Because faith is not the absence of pain, it's the decision to trust in the middle of it. It's the trembling voice that still says, "Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him." And when you say those words, you join a long line of saints and sufferers who have discovered that God is closest in the chaos, that He is not only the God of the mountaintop, but the God of the ashes, the one who kneels down in the dust, who speaks life into brokenness, who restores what we thought was lost forever. Because Job's ending is not just about doubling what was lost, it's about renewal, a new beginning, a deeper joy, a wider compassion, and a legacy that reaches far beyond his lifetime. The book of Job doesn't end with an explanation, it ends with a resurrection. And that is the promise that hovers over your life too. You may not understand the season you're in. The pain may still feel sharp. The silence may feel suffocating. But this story reminds you that silence is not absence, that pain is not punishment, that the whirlwind is not the end. It's the beginning of something sacred. And when the time comes, and it will come, you too will rise. Maybe not all at once, maybe slowly, gently, with healing in stages, but you will rise. And when you do, you'll carry something you didn't have before, a faith that has been tested, refined, and proven real. Just like Job. But even then, it's not just about Job, it's about you. Because if God preserved this story, this ancient, poetic, raw, sacred story, it's because He knew you would need it. He knew there would come a moment in your life when you would feel abandoned, confused, or crushed under the weight of something you never asked for. He knew that one day you would sit in your own version of the ashes and whisper, "Why?" And in that moment, the Spirit of God would reach into your memory, into your soul, and remind you, you are not the first to feel this. You are not alone. The book of Job doesn't give you neat answers. It gives you a companion. It gives you language for your sorrow. It gives you permission to grieve and rage and wrestle and wait. And in doing so, it lifts your eyes, slowly, gently. It invites you not to deny the darkness, but to light a candle in the middle of it. A candle called faith. A candle that says, "Even now I believe." There's a reason this story has endured for thousands of years, because suffering is a language that crosses every culture, every century. And yet, here in the middle of the Bible, we find a man who refuses to curse God, a man who walks through the worst that life can offer and still clings to hope, a man who teaches us that faith is not always loud. It's sometimes just one more breath, one more prayer, one more moment of staying open to God's voice. And God's voice does come, eventually, in His own time, in His own way, but it comes. That is a promise worth holding. That is a promise that Job now whispers to us from the pages of Scripture. He sees you, He will speak. He has not forgotten. Maybe you needed to hear that today. And if you are walking with someone who is suffering, Job's story is a guide for you too. Remember how his friends got it wrong. They tried to explain the unexplainable. They rushed to defend God instead of comforting their friend. They spoke about God instead of listening to Job. And for that, God rebuked them. Let that be a gentle reminder. Sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is be quiet. Sit, mourn, pray, be present. Don't rush to fix what only God can restore. Job teaches us to honor the sacredness of suffering, to respect the silence, to wait for God's voice, not force our own, because when God does speak, everything changes. And when He restores, it is never shallow, it is full, it is complete, it is deeper than before. And don't miss this. The God who spoke to Job in a whirlwind would one day come again, not in a storm, but in the stillness of a Bethlehem night, in the fragile cry of a baby, in the quiet strength of a carpenter, in the man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, who took our suffering upon Himself and gave us hope that death will not have the final word. Jesus is the ultimate answer to Job's cry. He is the Redeemer Job believed in long before Bethlehem. and he is your Redeemer too. So when you read Job's words, "I know that my Redeemer lives," you are reading prophecy, hope spoken into the dark, a whisper of resurrection before resurrection had a name. And now you know the name, Jesus, the one who not only sympathizes with our weakness but who bore it, the one who not only heals our wounds but who was wounded for us, the one who not only restores what was lost but gives us more than we could ask or imagine. This is why Job's story is not ancient history, it is living truth, and it is yours. If you have ever questioned, suffered, lost, grieved, or waited in the dark, this book is for you. This voice is for you. This hope is for you. You don't have to pretend anymore. You don't have to hold yourself together. You just have to hold on, just like Job did. And when the moment comes, when God breaks the silence, you will understand in a way you never have before. Not because he explained everything, but because you met him. And once you have seen God for yourself, no storm can undo you. No loss can destroy you, because you are anchored in something deeper. You are rooted in someone stronger. You are held. So breathe, weary soul, lift your head, take courage. The whirlwind is not your end, it is your meeting place. And the one who meets you there will not leave you the same. He is good. He is present. He is your Redeemer. And he lives. That reality changes everything, not just for Job, but for you. Because the fact that your Redeemer lives means there is no place too dark, no pain too deep, no question too heavy for God to carry. It means that suffering doesn't get the final word, resurrection does. It means that even if the world around you falls apart, even if your heart breaks in ways you never imagined, even if prayers go unanswered for a season, there is still a living God who holds every shattered piece in his hands. And he's not just holding them, he's shaping them, forming something new from what was lost, breathing life into the ruins. Job couldn't have imagined what restoration would look like, but it came, slowly, tenderly, deeply. And it didn't erase his sorrow, but it did redeem it. That's the difference. Restoration in God's hands doesn't mean forgetting, it means transforming. So if you've been wondering whether your story is too broken, too confusing, too far gone, let Job's story speak directly to your heart. No storm is too wild. No silence is too long. No loss is too final. The God who speaks from the whirlwind is still writing your story. He hasn't put down the pen, and he hasn't forgotten your name. He knows what you've lost. He knows what you've questioned. He knows the nights you laid awake asking why, with tears in your eyes and silence in your room, and he doesn't shame you for those nights. He sits with you in them, like he did with Job, not always with answers, but always with presence. Sometimes the greatest miracle isn't the change in your circumstances, it's the change in your spirit. It's waking up and realizing that despite it all, your heart is still beating. Your soul is still reaching. Your faith, though bruised and trembling, still whispers the name of your Redeemer. That is a miracle. That is victory. That is grace. And that grace becomes your foundation. Not the kind of foundation that keeps you from falling, but the kind that catches you when you fall. That's what Job discovered. His faith wasn't perfect, it was real. And that's what mattered most to God. Not polished prayers, but honest ones. Not answers, but intimacy. Not certainty, but trust. And in the end, God didn't just give Job things, he gave Job himself. His voice, his presence, his attention, his blessing. And that's what your heart is really aching for too, isn't it? Not just relief, not just explanations, but encounter. To know deep in your bones that God is with you, that he sees you, that he has not forsaken you. You don't need to earn that nearness. You don't need to have all the right words. You just need to come. Come with your pain, come with your questions, Come with your trembling faith and tired soul. Just come. He will meet you. He always does. Because he is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The God who met Job in the whirlwind is the God who meets you now. Not with shame, but with mercy. Not with cold distance, but with burning compassion. Not with a list of demands, but with open arms. So sit with that truth for a moment. Let it sink in. Let it quiet your fears. Let it comfort your weary heart. You are not forgotten. You are not invisible. You are not abandoned. The silence is not a wall, it's a doorway. And beyond it, God waits to speak. He may not say what you expect. He may not explain everything, but he will reveal himself. And when he does, like Job, you will realize that his presence is more precious than answers. His nearness is better than understanding. His voice is enough. Enough to heal. Enough to restore. Enough to carry you forward. And you will rise not the same as before, but changed, softer, stronger, wiser, more rooted in grace, more anchored in truth. And your story, your pain, your perseverance, your journey through the whirlwind will become a beacon for others. Because the book of Job is not just about Job, it's about all of us, all who suffer, all who question, all who endure, all who hold on to the hope that our Redeemer lives. And that, my friend, is the truth that holds you now. Not because you understand everything, but because you are known by the one who does. There is something profoundly freeing in that truth. You don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to carry the weight of every answer. You don't even have to pretend to be strong all the time. Because the one who formed the stars and the sea also formed you, and he knows your limits. He knows how deeply you feel. He knows when your soul is at its edge. And he doesn't love a future polished version of you. He loves you right here, right now, in the middle of the mess, in the middle of the mystery. That's one of the hardest and holiest lessons of the book of Job, that God's love is not performance-based. Job had nothing left to offer. No wealth, no health, no reputation, no control, just ashes and questions. And that's when God came. That's when he spoke. That's when he drew near, which means that maybe, just maybe, our emptiness is not a barrier to God, but a doorway. Because when everything else is stripped away and all that's left is your soul crying out in the dark, that's where real faith is born. Not the faith of comfort or convenience, but the faith that clings when there's nothing left to cling to. The faith that Job carried, trembling, through every wave of loss. The faith that still dares to say, "Blessed be the name of the Lord." That kind of faith doesn't come easy. It's not taught in sunny classrooms or learned through smooth seasons. It's forged in fire. And maybe that's what you're walking through right now. Maybe that's why Job's voice feels so close. Maybe it's because you're living the questions he once asked. You're holding the same fragile hope he once held. If so, you're in good company. You're not alone in the silence. You're not strange for struggling. You're not broken for crying. You're human. You're beloved. You're held by a God who knows how to carry people through storms, not just around them, but through them. And on the other side, there's more than just survival. There's transformation. That's what happened to Job. He didn't just get his life back, he became someone new. His heart expanded. His compassion deepened. His worship grew richer. And all of it began not with comfort, but with confrontation. Not with ease, but with encounter. And here's something else worth noticing. After Job sees God, he doesn't just receive blessing. He becomes a blessing. He prays for his friends. He intercedes for those who hurt him. He becomes a bridge between them and God. That's a picture of true spiritual maturity, not revenge, but redemption. Not payback, but prayer. Can you imagine that? The The same man who was wrongly accused, who sat in agony while others debated his worthiness, now lifting them up before the throne of God. That kind of grace only comes from a heart that has seen the face of mercy. And that's what Job had seen. You can too. Because when you've walked with God through the whirlwind, you emerge with eyes that see differently. You see people with more tenderness. You hear pain with more empathy. You speak slower. You love deeper, not because you're better, but because you've been broken and healed, emptied and filled, shaken and strengthened. That is the journey of Job, and it can be yours. Not the same path, not the same losses, but the same Redeemer, the same voice in the whirlwind, the same transformation, the same promise that nothing is wasted, not even the silence. So take heart, even if the restoration hasn't come yet, even if the ending still feels far off, even if the questions are still louder than the answers. This is not the end of your story. The God who restored Job is still restoring, still healing, still working. And even now, He is preparing something for you, something you may not yet see, but something beautiful, something that will one day make sense of what now seems senseless, something that will not just repair what was broken, but make it stronger than it was before. Because your Redeemer lives, and because He lives, you will live, fully, freely, fearlessly, with a hope that cannot be shaken. And on that day, when all things are made new, you'll look back with tears in your eyes and wonder in your soul and say, I thought I had lost everything, but I gained what matters most. I saw the face of God. And isn't that what our souls long for most? Not comfort, not clarity, not even restoration in the way we imagine it, but presence. To know that we are not alone. To see, even for a moment, that the one who created the heavens and earth sees us. That He steps into our suffering, not to shame us for our weakness, but to walk with us through it. That He is not a distant judge looking down from the clouds, but a compassionate Father who draws close in our darkest nights. The book of Job reminds us that God doesn't only dwell in temples or mountaintops. He also lives in the whirlwind, in the hospital room, in the quiet, sleepless night, in the prayer that barely makes it past your lips. He is there, not because you've done everything right, but because His love doesn't leave when life gets hard. In fact, it presses in closer. That's why this story matters now more than ever. In a world obsessed with quick fixes, shallow answers, and performance-based love, Job's story invites us to slow down, to sit in the questions, to grieve honestly, to worship even when our hands are trembling. It's not comfortable, but it's real, and real is where God meets us. You may not have a whirlwind, you may not hear an audible voice from heaven, but that doesn't mean God is silent. Sometimes His whispers are louder than thunder. Sometimes His nearness is hidden in the hands of a friend, the line of a psalm, the unexpected moment of peace in the middle of pain. You don't have to chase signs. You just have to stay open, attentive, honest, and He will speak in His time, in His way, and always with love. Because the same God who created Leviathan and Behemoth, those wild, terrifying creatures that symbolize chaos and mystery, also created you, tender, complex, fragile, sacred. And if He holds the monsters of the deep in check, don't you think He can hold your life too? Job learned that, not because he found a formula, but because he found God. And that changed everything. Not instantly, not without scars, but deeply, permanently. His pain did not vanish, but it was transformed. It became a vessel for wisdom, a path to intimacy, a mirror for generations to see their own sorrow and still find hope. You're part of that. Every tear you've cried, every prayer you've whispered, every breath you've taken when you didn't know if you could keep going, it all matters. It's all seen. And one day it will all be redeemed. Maybe not in the way you expect, maybe not in this lifetime, but in the hands of God, nothing is wasted. That's why Job's story ends not with a triumph over people, but with blessing. Not because he demanded it, but because God gave it, freely, generously, unexpectedly. That's grace. And that same grace is being poured over your life even now, quietly, steadily, like rain soaking into dry ground. You may not see it yet, but it's working, healing, restoring, rebuilding. So if you're in the middle of your own Job chapter, take heart. You're not stuck, you're being shaped. You're not being punished, you're being prepared. And the God who is writing your story hasn't skipped a single line. Every word matters. Every season counts. Every wound will one day become part of your witness. Because Job didn't just survive his suffering, he became a voice for those who would suffer after him. And that might be part of your calling too, to be a comfort to others, to speak truth with humility, to walk beside those who feel forgotten, to say with quiet authority, I've been there, I've wept those tears, and I still believe. You don't have to be perfect to be powerful. You don't need every answer to carry peace. You just need presence. And presence is exactly what God offers. Not just once, not just at the end, but through every moment of the journey. In the grief, in the silence, in the rising. And when all is said and done, when the questions fade and the whirlwind calms, you'll stand like Job with more than you lost. Not just in possessions or comfort, but in depth, in truth, in God Himself. And that is the greatest gift of all. Not the livestock, not the gold, not the long life or restored reputation. Those things were good, but they weren't the core of Job's restoration. The true gift was that Job came to know God personally, intimately, not through second-hand stories or memorized rituals, but through encounter, through experience, through suffering, yes, but more importantly, through presence. And once you have seen God like that, nothing in your life will ever be ordinary again. Because that kind of seeing doesn't fade. That kind of encounter marks you. It changes how you walk through the world. You speak more gently. You listen more deeply. You forgive more freely. You weep more honestly. Not because you're trying to be someone else, but because you've been with God. You've heard His voice in the whirlwind. You've felt His nearness in the silence. And it has carved something eternal into your soul. And that's where Job's story becomes more than just a story. It becomes a prophecy, a mirror, a promise. Because the God of Job is still writing stories like this one, still meeting broken hearts in broken places, still revealing Himself not through lectures but through love, through whisper and wonder, through questions that open your soul instead of closing your mind, through pain that breaks you open so heaven can rush in. The book of Job is not about getting back what was lost. It's about becoming someone new, someone who has walked through the fire and still lifts their hands in praise, someone who has lost much and still says, God gives and God takes away, blessed be His name. Someone who has faced the silence of heaven and found that, even there, God is good. And here's the secret. That person isn't just Job, it's you. If you choose to keep walking, if you choose to trust even when you don't understand, if you choose to believe that your Redeemer lives not just in Scripture but in your pain, in your night, in your now. This is what sets the book of Job apart from every other ancient story. It doesn't tie everything up with a neat bow. It doesn't pretend that life makes sense. It doesn't shy away from grief. It leans into it. It looks it in the face. And then it whispers the truth that grief can't silence. God is still here. And He always will be. Not just in the light, but in the shadow. Not just when you're winning, but when you're weeping. Not just when prayers are answered, but when they seem ignored. Because He is faithful, not because of what you feel, but because of who He is. So let the book of Job anchor you. Let it shape your prayers. Let it break the lies that suffering means you failed, or that silence means God is gone. Let it remind you that questions are not a sign of weak faith. They are the raw language of a faith that still wants God, even when nothing makes sense. And when you speak those questions out loud, you're not offending heaven. You're joining a sacred tradition. You're stepping into the dust and ashes with Job and Moses and David and Jeremiah and even Jesus Himself, who cried out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Not because he didn't believe, but because his faith was that real, that human, that honest. This is what it means to follow God with your whole heart, to bring your whole self, your joy, your grief, your praise, your confusion, into the presence of the one who already knows it all and still chooses to love you without holding back. And as you do, something sacred happens. Your heart begins to heal, not because the pain vanishes, but because you're no longer carrying it alone. Because the God of Job, the God of the whirlwind and the whisper, is now carrying you. And He will never let you go. That truth is what gives the book of Job its enduring strength, its healing power, and its invitation to every generation who finds themselves wandering in a season of loss, confusion, or waiting. You see, the real triumph of Job's story is not that he found a path back to blessing, but that he discovered God's faithfulness in the middle of his darkness. He learned, as we must all learn, that the presence of suffering does not mean the absence of God. If anything, suffering becomes the place where God's presence is most deeply revealed. And this is what makes Job's story more than just an ancient account. It becomes a map for our own hearts. When life unravels, when prayers feel unanswered, when nothing makes sense, you have a path marked out before you. You can be honest. You can cry out. You can bring every doubt, every tear, every hope and heartbreak right to God's feet. And you will find not a lecture, but a listening ear. Not a list of requirements, but a welcome. Not a God who stands far off, but a God who draws near. That is the promise that echoes through every chapter of Job. It's the reason this book has comforted millions across centuries. Because it tells the truth. Life is hard. Faith is sometimes a fight. Answers may never come. But God's love is unbreakable, unchanging, unstoppable. Even when you don't feel it. Even when you can't see it. Even when the whirlwind is all around you. And as you keep walking, one step, one breath, one day at a time, you will discover what Job discovered, that the story isn't over until God says it is, that the ending may surprise you, that what feels like an ending can become a new beginning, that grace can fill the gaps that loss has carved, that healing can come, not just to your circumstances, but to your soul. So remember this, your Redeemer lives. Your suffering is not wasted. Your questions are not ignored. You are not invisible. You are not unloved. The whirlwind is not forever. And the one who met Job in the storm will meet you in yours. When the final page turns and you look back on all you've walked through, may you find yourself whispering the same words Job did. I had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. May that vision sustain you. May that encounter transform you. May that hope carry you forward. And as your story continues, through every season, every high and low, know this: the God of Job is your God too. He is writing your story with compassion, with wisdom, with endless love. He will bring you through. He will restore what was lost in ways you cannot yet imagine. He will hold you in every night and celebrate with you in every morning. Because He is faithful. Because He is near. Because He will never let you go.